Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Nostalgia Trap program. My name is David Parsons. I am thankful that you're listening to the show. I have a great guest for you today and a conversation that I really enjoyed. My guest name is Jeremy C. Young. He is an assistant professor of history at Dixie State University and the author of a book that caught my eye on Twitter when I was surfing through the history section of Twitter. I stumbled upon his work, and his book is called The Age of Charisma, Leaders, Followers, and Emotions in American Society, 1870 to 1940. And, you know, I think that I first saw Jeremy's work in the context of the moment when a few weeks ago we had a horrible flash of celebrity news in which we had to consider the possibility of Oprah Winfrey as, I don't know why I even use her last name. She's just kind of, at this point, the level of a Greek god. We can just say Oprah. But when Oprah was kind of offered up by people on social media as a potential candidate to knock Trump out, I think it was in the context of her speech at the Golden Globes in which she addressed the Me Too, #MeToo phenomenon and made a tremendous impact on the crowd and I guess on the people watching on TV. In either case, Jeremy Young's work definitely came up. And I think he kind of did a little tour of radio shows and podcasts as he was asked questions about his work that kind of touches on this idea of charisma and affect and the kind of like personal qualities, personal magnetic qualities that draw a crowd to be kind of mesmerized by particular political figures, and how that has had a very, you know, particular impact on the history of politics in the United States, particularly in the late 19th and into the 20th and now 21st century. So certainly Trump's whole kind of affect and I guess what you would call personal magnetism is a part of the whole phenomenon. So we had a great time talking about this, and I hope you enjoy. And if you enjoy these conversations with academics and other folks about what's going on in American history and what's going on right now and how that kind of sits with the wider historical context of this country, then please consider donating to the show's Patreon. You can find it at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. The truth is, I want to keep doing these interviews, but I'm like many Americans, I think it's about 78% of Americans actually, I'm a paycheck to paycheck kind of person. So any money you can give me in appreciation for the work I'm doing, creating the show, would be really, really nice and would help me out a lot and let me know that I should keep doing these interviews because I really enjoy doing them and I think they're useful for a lot of folks. So if you enjoy the show, please consider donating $5, $10, whatever you can a month. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is me talking to Professor and historian Jeremy C. Young. How's your semester going so far?
Oh, busy. I teach a first semester block course, which is just about done, but I have, so it's the equivalent of a 5-course load right now on top of everything else.
Wow.
That should ease up in just a couple of, you're no stranger to this. But
no,
that
not at all.
Just a couple of weeks, so. How about you?
So far so good. I mean, I just moved. I don't know if you know this at all, but I just moved from New York. I was in New York City for my entire, graduate school and adjuncting there, and had been set up there for a long time, adjuncting at a number of different schools at CUNY, the City University of New York.
Right.
Yeah, so I just moved to California last summer. So I'm literally in the middle of reestablishing myself out here, but I've been lucky enough to have some contacts, and I'm starting to. I have like a full load of adjuncting and stuff this semester. So I only
that's good.
Lost one semester, but yeah, things are pretty good. What are block courses?
Oh, block courses.
Yeah.
So this is it's basically a 7-week course instead of a 16-week course.
Okay.
So but when I started here, it was a 10-week course, and then they shortened it to 7 weeks. It used to be the second half of the semester, but now it's the first half. And I volunteer to teach it because it makes me super busy half the semester, but then the other half of the semester I'm only teaching 3 courses. So
yeah,
that clears up some
doesn't
time.
sound too bad. It's fun too. It's fun. It's funny because I'm actually teaching in a program that's an adult learning program right now at one of the schools that literally is just 2 hours a week with older people. Everyone, well, I'm supposed to say that they're mature. It's a mature audience, but everyone's like, over, I would say over 65, 70 years old. And, the course is 4 weeks. It just meets 4 times. So like thinking about how to squeeze some history into a shorter amount of time is something I've been thinking about lately.
That's great though. That's a nice sort of condensed schedule, and then you can sort of do your own stuff the rest of the time.
Oh yeah, it's fun. Yeah, it doesn't take much time, and they don't read anything. It's literally like a presentation and discussion. So it's nice. It feels more like public history than teaching in some ways, but at the same time, everyone's like really engaged in the discussion. So I've never actually right now I'm teaching like the whole range of people. I tutor high school kids. I have a college class where I teach kids in college. And then I teach this course for older folks. So it's like the channel switching between ages is fun for sure. Especially when you're talking about history. That's what I wanted to talk to you about today. It was kind of like, the way that history, people take it differently depending on their age. And it seems like history has got a particular, relationship to the way people remember things. But you study history from a little bit further back. I do 20th century history, so I feel like there's a lot of people that still remember.
Right. I mean, I do 20th century history too. It's just early 20th century.
That's right. I mean, I feel like a lot of the people that you talk about though are dead though. Is that right?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. I mean, my great uncle died a couple of years ago, and he was 107, and he was born when Theodore Roosevelt was president. And that's about as close a link as you get at this point. It's pretty remote.
So, Jeremy, I always like to hear where people come from and how they became historians. But when you look back on your life, I mean, first of all, can you tell me a little bit about where you come from, and maybe a little bit about kind of when you think back of what forces were there in your life that pushed you towards becoming a historian? Are there any things that pop out in your young life that you can think of?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that I've been sort of listening to the archives of your show ever since you said you wanted to talk to me, and it's a great show. I love it, and it's nobody's really asked me about my background in this way before, and so it's an interesting story. I grew up in California and Arizona, lived in Los Angeles until I was 10, and then moved to northern Arizona until I went to college. And I had kind of an odd upbringing. I had a sort of I guess I would say I had a fairly abusive upbringing. My mom in particular was fairly abusive. And I was also homeschooled the entire time. So homeschooling, of course, can be a great educational option, but when you're in a family where there's abuse going on, it's just really isolating.
I can imagine.
So it was kind of a weird experience. I had a very good education. I was very smart. I learned really well. That's not always true in homeschooling situations, but it was very true for me. And then at the same time, I had this sort of isolation and this experience with a very sort of emotionally manipulative parent. And so I was very interested in history from a young age. I didn't really realize that I wanted to be a historian. I think it was sort of pointed out to me when I was in high school. Someone
noticed it.
I just read a lot of history for fun. I started with ancient history, and then I was really interested in presidents, of course, as many people are growing up.
Yep.
And I was also very interested in politics, and I think the politics in some ways was closer to being related to my upbringing, because growing up in a family where words don't mean what they seem to mean was very, very formative for me. And I got this sense that words can be weapons. Words can have meanings beyond what they seem to mean, and things can make a lot of sense in a very sort of denotative way, but in a connotative way, mean something totally different. Sort of play on the emotions in a way that it doesn't seem obvious. And
reading messages, it sounds like you become adept at kind of reading messages underneath the messages, if that makes sense.
Right, exactly. And the sense that, like, people assume, and this is something that I've talked about really ad nauseum in my historical work, that people assume that when someone like William Jennings Bryan, who I write about, talks about free silver, that the message he's conveying is about free silver, and the message that his audiences are getting is about free silver. And I just don't think it is. I think that this is something I learned early on, but I think it's true for a lot of people. There's a lot of sort of subverbal stuff going on. There's a lot of emotional signaling and connotative work, and a lot of people process the entire world that way. They don't look at the world as though it's a sort of series of ideologies. I think not everyone is very ideological. People are influenced by these sort of emotional subtexts. And so I was very interested in this sort of, politics interested me because I developed this sort of finely tuned sense of justice. But at the same time, I was also aware that, people, particularly on the left, are obsessed with what politicians are saying and doing about issues. And on the right, I feel like people sort of recognize better that politics is emotional. Politics is about what isn't being said and what's being sort of hinted at, and being, what you can read in a tone of voice or a gesture or a look. And so I got very interested in all of that. I didn't really know that was what I was interested in yet when I was in high school, but I had those interests very early on.
And when you talk about you're interested in politics, what's going on in politics? Is there a particular politician that you're looking at, or a particular? I always like to hear kind of like what was the president that kind of got you into thinking about current events and politics in this way? Because for me it was growing up during. I grew up during the Reagan years, but I was really young and really only able to kind of capture the emotional elements of Reagan that you're talking about. And so,
right.
On television, I didn't really have any concept of Reagan as anything other than kind of a kindly grandfather that told jokes and kind of made everybody laugh. And he seemed like a very warm and positive presence to me as a child. And it's only that when I got older, I realized, what all that kind of emotional signaling was propping up, an ideology that I found pretty repulsive. But who were the politicians, and what was the politics that you first were thinking about when you were considering this stuff? I guess this is high school?
Actually, earlier in some ways. I've been interested in politics as long as I can remember. And originally I thought of myself as a sort of moderate. And I didn't really identify as someone on the left until I got to college, and not even, to the degree that I'm even more on the left now, not until graduate school. So the first politician that I got at least somewhat interested in was Ross Perot, of all people.
Oh, wow. Of course.
And the only thing at the age of 8, the only thing I really understood about Ross Perot was that he was an independent and he didn't like political parties. And that seemed to make sense to me because political parties seemed like this sort of structure that was that was sort of ordering people around and taking all these good ideas and compressing them into 2 party lines. And I just thought that was stupid, and that someone who would just run on his own was a good idea. Of course, I didn't really understand what Ross Perot stood for. I didn't understand the intricacies of trade policy when I was 8, or that Ross Perot was an oil kingpin who was going to help crash the economy of California, or any of those.
This is 1992, right? When he ran in
1992, yeah.
Yeah, right.
And then after that, after we moved to Arizona in 1995, I got very interested in a city councilman in Flagstaff, Arizona, who was sort of a very interesting guy. He identified as a Republican, but within the context of local politics, he was a sort of smart growth advocate, whereas the leadership of the city were all these realtors who were just, unlimited growth advocates. And he was, my mom actually invited him to my 13th birthday. So
wow, the city council.
Yeah, that was pretty. It's a small town, so it's not like it was it's not like he's some famous guy, but I was just incredibly starstruck by that. That was amazing. Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to interrupt, but can I ask you, like, was there a particular ideology or religion that led your mom to homeschool you? And if so, how did that ideology kind of impact you when you're, I don't know, developing your own political ideas?
So a lot of homeschooling comes out of religious fundamentalism, but my parents were secular. It wasn't religion at all. It really was, honestly, I think, just a sort of, in her better moments, a desire to, give me a sort of more direct education. She had advanced education herself, and she wanted to sort of convey that to me. And then in her worst moments, I think just a way of sort of isolating me and controlling me. But neither of my parents, I mean, my dad, who was not abusive, was also really secular. My mom was ancestrally Jewish, but only culturally so, and my dad was not.
Okay.
So no, not really. And then politically speaking, my mom identified as a moderate, although as long as I've been alive, she's really only voted for Democrats.
Right. Yeah, I was just kind of curious about that element, because I feel like homeschooling is on the rise in some respects in America. I don't know if that's true, but I get the impression it is. And there are, I feel like there are a growing number of people who are kind of homeschooling for a number of different reasons, whether they are secular or religious. There's a lot of different forces in America pushing people to make that decision about their children.
I think that's true. And if you look at the origins of homeschooling, it's sort of founded by secular figures like John Holt in the 1960s and religious fundamentalists like Rushdoony in the 1970s, who are coming at it from very different perspectives, but both have this sort of, let's sort of absent ourselves from society and culture, and they're sort of negative.
Right.
There's a lot of different reasons that people homeschool, and in this case, I think I don't know how influential those reasons were in my upbringing, but I've certainly met a lot of people since then who were very influenced by all of those different groups, particularly the religious fundamentalist one.
Okay, back to the city councilman. Sorry.
Sure. No, that's fine.
You had a city councilman come to your birthday party. And it sounds like you're at this age, already starting to have a kind of a sophisticated view of politics if you're already kind of seeing the messages underneath. But it sounds like also you're not particularly when I interrupted you just now, I think you were talking about how the particular politics and particular policies weren't necessarily your wheelhouse at that moment.
Right. The only policy that I was particularly interested in when I was, 10, 13, was environmentalism. That was my sort of introduction to policy positions. And of course, that's not an issue that's that important to me these days, although I'm very interested in climate change and a sort of ecological perspective on environmentalism. But the kind of, let's not cut down the trees around town. That's just not something that really animates me anymore. But I was very invested in that at the time. And this was the era of Fern Gully and sort of a resurgence of preservationist Sierra Club style environmental politics.
Really... You're reminding me of all of this now, and the Ross, that whole landscape of Ross Perot and the Sierra Club, and things. Have moved into very different places, and particularly when talking about environmental issues, for sure.
Exactly. And so then it was 2000, and John McCain ran for president, and I was living in Arizona, and I got really into John McCain. I was super excited about John McCain. Because in that version of John McCain, I like to say that John McCain is, like his hero Theodore Roosevelt, is someone who is more animated politically by who it is that he hates at a particular moment than by whatever his ideology is. And so at the moment, in 2000, McCain has sort of fluctuated between being this conservative who opposes, Democratic presidents and this moderate who opposes Republican presidents. And at the time, he hated George W. Bush, and so he was my hero, right?
Yeah,
he was this sort of moderate. If you think of yourself as a moderate, John McCain 2000 is your ideal presidential candidate. And I got really into John McCain. I was super excited about him. And what started to happen was these candidates that I supported, the city councilman, McCain. They started to, they would lose a race, and then they would sort of drift to the right.
Yeah.
And it would really frustrate me. And so the next thing that happened, I get to college. I went to college, by the way, at a college called St. Mary's College of Maryland, which is a public liberal arts college in Maryland. And so that was
there a reason why you found yourself going to Maryland from Arizona, or did you just want to get far away?
People assume that I wanted to get far away. I wasn't really aware of what was going on in my family at the time, and I really didn't. I wanted to go to a liberal arts college, and I couldn't justify the expense, even though my parents were willing to pay for it. And so this was a way to go that was cheaper. Even out-of-state tuition in Maryland was like half the price of a liberal arts college anywhere else.
Okay,
so
that makes sense.
I went there.
Yep.
And I got into this honors program, and it was within the college, and so that's why I went there. And it was a very liberating experience in a lot of ways. I mean, for the first time, I was sort of out of my family. I'd been really isolated growing up. I hadn't known a lot of people, and then all these people are there, and I just made a million friends. Met my wife there in college, which was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I also made some friends, some lifelong friends who were very politically active. My best friend is actually a Democratic political operative and has been ever since he graduated. Mm-hmm. So we roomed together, and he sort of took it upon himself to help shape my ideology. I mean, he is. I would say he's a sort of left liberal. He's not a true leftist by any means, but he voted for Hillary over Bernie, mm-hmm. but he would have preferred Elizabeth Warren over either. So that kind of sort of left liberal figure, and he sort of spent a lot of time interrogating my political beliefs. And what I realized was that a lot of the beliefs that I'd grown up with, I was definitely left of center. The only sort of centrist beliefs that I retained, and then I still retain in some ways, were in foreign policy, where I'm still much more of an interventionist than your standard leftist.
Right.
But on domestic policy, so for instance, I describe myself as someone who was in high school, I would tell people that I was not pro-choice. And then, so my friend said, you don't understand. And he sort of dragged me to this feminist meeting where there's a Planned Parenthood representative talking about Roe. And she explained Roe, and I said, oh, well, that's what I believe.
Right.
So I realized I was pro-choice and just had sort of bought into the rhetoric of
that's kind of incredible, and
I
think that is so common and so incredible and kind of scary about politics, because I feel like there are lots of people walking around in America who don't know what their politics are, who literally think their politics are different than what they actually are, which is kind of gets to what you're talking about, and what your work is about, is that kind of like misunderstanding what you really believe and then having someone explain it in a way that makes you see a different angle on it, and we're like, oh my God, I'm actually pro-choice and I thought I wasn't, which is like kind of extraordinary. But I think that again, that's not too uncommon in the way people think about politics.
I think that's true, and I tend to think that for a lot of people, actual ideological beliefs are really skin deep, and they may not have very strong ideological commitments, and so it may not be that things are being explained to them what they actually believe, as much as what people are explaining to them, a particular type of belief with the emotional content that they're looking for.
Right, and which explains why the rise of right-wing radio, but also cable news, and the 24-hour cable news seems to know this very well. That packaging the political stuff within the emotion is for them the way of selling their product. But it also seems like it's become the dominant way that political discourse is run in the so-called mainstream media. So it's really I don't know. It seems like something that people fret about a lot, but you're hitting on something that I think is important.
I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, I was sort of different from your average 18-year-old kid who didn't know a lot about politics, because I was really interested in politics and I was really interested in ideas. But I just didn't really know. I hadn't had a lot of exposure. I'd done a lot of reading, but I hadn't had a lot of exposure to people with varying ideas. And so this made a big difference. And what really happened was, so I got to college in 2002. Mm-hmm. And near the end of that semester, I think it was the very beginning of my second semester, so January 2003, my friend was in the College Democrats, and College Democrats, as they are at many schools, are sort of a cesspool of people who are deeply ambitious, who are trying to get somewhere politically and use that position to get there.
Yeah.
And so there were these two guys in there. There was this one guy who was just a jerk, just an absolute jerk, and like sent out all student emails with sexually suggestive comments in them. And then there was another guy who later turned out to get arrested for being a peeping Tom.
Oy.
And these were the two guys who were running the club. And
Wow.
so these guys were they were not progressive. They were very sort of centrist Democrats who didn't really care about ideas and were just trying to get ahead.
Right.
And they went to the DNC winter meeting in January, and they call up my friend who was their political rival. They weren't even really friends. They call him up and they say, "Oh my God, you have to listen to this speech." And so I'm sitting there with him in his dorm room. He pulls up this speech on his laptop, and it's Howard Dean speaking at the DNC winter meeting. And
yeah.
This was the very first speech that Dean gave in the 2004 campaign, where which is sort of the model of his stump speech, where he says, I'm from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, and what I want to know is this, and what I want to know is that. And we were watching this, and it was just like, this is, I can't even describe what that feeling was like. It was like, we are watching this incredible political moment. It's like Martin Luther King or William Jennings Bryan.
And isn't that insane to say that? I mean, because, Howard Dean, I remember this moment. I mean, it was electrifying, and it really felt like, and part of it, I mean, don't you think that part of it was the atmosphere of the immediate post 9/11 Bush years, feeling like, there was a feeling of darkness and a feeling of hopelessness in some sense, and for whatever reason, Howard Dean was able to, I mean, very briefly, I think, seize upon that, and it seems like, I don't know, Howard Dean's story there. I'll let you continue with what happened to him, but it seems like that this is a lot to do with the emotional signaling element of it that you're talking about.
Oh, absolutely, because Dean was and is a centrist in terms of his actual politics.
Right.
In his rhetoric, in his style, he's a flamethrower.
Yeah.
And it was just electrifying. And so we got really excited about Dean, and my friend actually introduced me to some of the blogs that were around at the time. This was actually before, I think Daily Kos had been founded in the month that Dean gave that speech.
Wow.
So most of the activism was going on what we called the U blog, which was basically a blogspot blog run by a guy named Aziz, who liked Howard Dean, and this sort of mushroom. At the time, Dean's campaign didn't even have a website, so this blog was the sort of center of organizing.
Oh, yeah, this was for those that are young that don't remember this was the golden age of the blogosphere. I don't even know if anyone uses the phrase blogosphere anymore, but it was, social media, I feel like Twitter, maybe Facebook a little bit, have become the kind of dominant modes through which people express politics online now, but blogs were everything, and particularly during the Bush years, it was the first. I feel like the Bush years were the first time where the internet was really exploding that way politically.
Absolutely. And this was what's interesting is at the same time I was doing this, I had actually founded a club on campus called the College Nonpartisans, and that was a completely different thing. I was still obsessed with this idea of political parties are bad and they sort of cut off independent thought. And I really felt like this nonpartisan thing that I was doing was sort of almost like founding a new philosophy, like a new way of looking at the world. And I wrote this manifesto for it, which I reread recently. It's really weird. It's like a mixture of sort of libertarianism and left liberalism and secular humanism. I actually sent a copy of this manifesto to Paul Kurtz, the secular humanist, and he said he liked it. And I just treasured that email. I got this email from him. He says, "I like that. That sounds good." And it was great.
This is such perfect like history, politics, nerd stuff. I mean,
absolutely.
The writing of a manifesto, and like I can just imagine, like looking at it and feel it with pride and being like, I have discovered the third path.
Exactly, absolutely. But at the same time, I was just so attracted to Dean as this charismatic figure.
Right.
And it was so weird. I mean, it's hard to convey what that was like. I mean, Ezra Klein and I are the same age.
Uh-huh.
But Ezra was always a little bigger than I was, even back then. I mean, he had his own blog that people would read. I was just a commenter on these blogs. And so he and I got into this fight one time in the comment thread of the U blog because he was a Gary Hart supporter who didn't end up running in 2004.
Wow.
And I was sort of yelling at him like how can you ignore the charisma of Howard Dean? It was just amateur hour stuff. And but ultimately I decided that I couldn't be part of a club that was opposed to political parties when I was supporting the guy who ran the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so I quit College Nonpartisans, and I focused full-time on Dean. And that, of course, was just devastating when his campaign fell apart and he comes in third in Iowa. And I guess what I learned from that experience was a couple of things. First of all, that I was definitely a Democrat. I was definitely on the left. I was not any kind of conservative, and that
no more John McCain for you.
No more John McCain. No,
right.
Although I did vote for Senate in 2004, but that was the last time I think I voted for a Republican in a race that was, that had Democrats on the ballot. But second of all, that I had this sort of strange attraction to these charismatic figures, and then I needed to understand why.
Mm-hmm.
So what I haven't mentioned is that when I went to college, my plan was I was not planning to be a historian or get into politics. My plan was that I was going to be a concert pianist, of all things.
Oh wow, that's an angle I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, and that's what I was pretty good, and I was really pushed at home into that field. That my dad was very proud of me for. I was in a couple of competitions in high school, did pretty well. He would play the recordings for people in his hobby shop that he owned, and it was nice. But then I realized about halfway through college that I hated practicing.
Mm-hmm.
And so my original plan was I was going to try to make it big as a concert pianist, but I was going to get a second major in history so I could go into that as a sort of backup group. And then I decided about halfway through that I wanted to make that the primary career because I really enjoyed writing papers. All this stuff in my history classes that other students didn't like was really meaningful to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did end up actually finishing up the music degree, although I finished it in music composition, mostly because I was almost done with it at that point. But I decided by that time that I kind of wanted to go into history. Mm. And so I did that. I wrote an undergraduate thesis on these figures in New York who were having this sort of club in World War I about France. They were Francophiles. They loved France, and I was trying to figure out why. So that was it was okay. It was a sort of interesting piece of writing.
How did you stumble upon that subject? How did you find that group of that club?
So I was living in the International Language House my sophomore year, and I was taking a French class my first semester. That was the class where I met my wife, by the way, who was French. But I didn't do very well in that class, and I decided I didn't want to take a French class my second semester because it would tank my GPA. And so instead of doing that, I decided to do an independent study. I had to take some kind of French course to stay in the language house. I didn't want to move out of my housing. And so I decided to take this independent study with my with the French history professor in the history department. And so basically I just wrote a 30-page paper, and that was the entire course. I did a lot of research, wrote a 30-page paper about U.S. and French involvement in World War I. And
It seems like a lot of your work, because I mean, even after you continue, and I want to get to your book, but it seems like a lot of your work has to do with like kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Is there a reason why, or is that just where you landed?
Well, I felt I would read these speeches by people like Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson in particular. I loved Woodrow Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
I would read his speeches, and I would just be inspired by his speeches the way I was inspired by these political figures.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really wanted to write about Wilson. And so when I applied to graduate school, I told everyone in my applications that I wanted to write a book about Woodrow Wilson and basically how he was right about the League of Nations. And so basically I wanted to write the book that John Milton Cooper wrote about Woodrow Wilson,
right?
Which August Texture wrote before him, and which it was already out. I mean, I didn't understand.
We've heard enough about Wilson, Jeremy.
I know, and I didn't understand what it meant to write an original piece of research, and not to mention that, the more I read about Wilson, the more I feel that his critics are right about him, and I've moved to the left since then. I'm not nearly as enamored of Wilson as I used to be.
But it's totally understandable. I feel like Wilson is within that pantheon of American presidents like Abraham Lincoln or even Theodore Roosevelt, and even, FDR, and then going back to the Founding Fathers, that Americans from a wide range of different political ideologies and ideas, they respond to those things, and it's I think it's very understandable to be charmed by Woodrow Wilson. And then maybe be not charmed as you learn more about him later.
Well, what I was very interested by is why I was so charmed by him. I mean, I don't think that's what I went into the project with, but I got to Indiana University,
mm-hmm.
From where I did my PhD, and I got in a lot of places, and I had opportunities to study with other people, and I went to Indiana and I actually went to Indiana even while my wife was going to Rice, so we were apart for 4 years, and the reason we were apart was because I had to study with Michael McGurr. I had to study with Michael McGurr. I could not. Once I met him, once I read his books, I had to study with him. He was the guy who understood. I'll never forget my first conversation with him. I sent out, when I was looking at graduate schools, I sent out emails to about 20 professors that I could imagine working with, and just asked them some questions. And he responded to my email by saying he wanted to call me up. And this was before I had even applied. And so I called him on the phone, and I started talking to him, and he says, the questions that you asked in that email are wrong. They're the wrong questions. And I said, okay, well, what are the right questions? And so he said, and then he laid out all these questions I should be asking. And I said, okay, what are the answers at Indiana? And then he laid out the answers, and then he just gives me all this free advice about how to apply, and every single piece of advice he gave me was correct. Every single piece. And so
you found a mentor, it sounds like.
I found a mentor. This is the guy who's going to help me take my sort of inchoate ideas and turn them into something real.
Right.
And so I went to Indiana, and his philosophy is that you start working on the dissertation the day you set foot in the graduate program. You start thinking about it. You don't write it yet. But you start trying to figure out what your topic should be. And so I sat down with him, and I said, well, here's what I want to write about. I said, you shouldn't write about Woodrow Wilson, but what you should do is go home and think about what it is about Woodrow Wilson that you really care about.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went home and thought about it for a week, and I came back and we met again. And I said, what I'm really interested in is why the way I phrased it was that I was interested in leadership, studying leadership,
right?
Which is closer to what I ended up studying. But what I think I may have said, or at least I was thinking at the time, that what I really wanted to know was why so many people were so attracted to Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah,
what it was about Wilson that was so emotionally meaningful to these people. Because I had always had this sense from early childhood that people don't really respond to what's being said. They respond to how it's being said. They respond to some kind of emotional content that's going on that's not really having to do with the ideas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so I just did a lot of reading, and I came up with the book that I ended up writing, which is called The Age of Charisma.
Yeah, so let me say that the name of that book, and I'll say it at the introduction of this too, because I want my listeners to check this book out. I think it's one that kind of plays with a lot of ideas we talk about on this show. So this is Jeremy Young's book, The Age of Charisma: Leaders, Followers, and Emotions in American Society, 1870 to 1940. And just the title itself is really intriguing because it makes me think about, okay, I was looking at your bio before I sat down to talk to you today, and your bio says that you're interested in kind of studying. In part, one of the things that it mentions that you're interested in studying about American history is the history of emotions and the history of how emotions function in American history. And that's just right. I just found that idea really intriguing. I thought that from two perspectives. One is like, how do you do that? Because it seems tricky to get into psychology and social psychology in that way and be talking about emotions. It seems like the sources are going to be tricky, but also it seems so highly obviously resonant with current American politics, which seems to function on emotional channels maybe perhaps more than ever before right now in the age of Trump. So your book I think is a really, really prescient one, and one that I think that listeners of this show would like to check out. So I want to make sure I mention that. But let's talk a little bit about it. How did you conceive of this idea? First of all, I mean, it sounds like it's in part coming out of your discussions with his name is Michael McGurr, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So how did you come to how did this become like a coherent idea that led to this book?
I would say it was a very long process because it's not the kind of dissertation that a lot of people write. Really, it's not a sort of take a very concrete set of phenomena and try to figure out what caused them and how they affected society. It's let's look at this thing that everybody seems to be sort of tapping into, but nobody can really explain why.
Yeah, it's hard to get a handle on this subject. There's not one particular story to tell. It seems like there's a host of phenomenon you're trying to describe.
Well, the first thing, I mean, I read some books, but the first thing that I did actually was I went on these newspaper databases, things like America's Historical Newspapers, which is a Redex database, historical 19th century newsletters, newspapers, and some of the ProQuest databases. And I searched for charisma. I found absolutely nothing. I eventually discovered that word only makes its debut in the United States when people start really when H.H. Girth and C. Wright Mills bring over their translation of part of Max Weber's Economy and Society in the 1930s.
Okay.
And there is some parts of that are brought over by Talcott Parsons in the 20s, but it's not really until the 30s that people start talking about this. And so then I started looking for all these other words that seemed like they might fit. And the one that I discovered that everyone was using at the time, they didn't call this phenomenon charisma. They called it personal magnetism. Mm-hmm. And so all these discussions, especially in the 1880s for some reason, people are obsessed with this idea of personal magnetism. What is personal magnetism? Who has personal magnetism? And they seem to have no idea what it is.
It almost sounds like it would emerge from the 19th century kind of mystical thinking, Right.
Well, and the term comes from Mesmer's magnetic fluid theory.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that. There are these people who say that, expert fishermen can entice fish out of the water with personal magnetism and things like that. But for the most part, people are applying this to people. They're applying this to politicians and to religious leaders.
Right.
The guy who gets described. So the two people who come up the most often in the 1880s as being personally magnetic are James Blaine, the Republican politician from Maine, whose nickname was the Magnetic Man.
Wow.
And then, but even more than Blaine, the one who comes up over and over again is Henry Ward Beecher.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the way I started with this was I just wrote a chapter about Henry Ward Beecher and James Blaine, and I just did a lot of research on them and found what people were saying about them and how they were describing their personal magnetism. And what I discovered, and I don't want to, this is not really a linear discovery. It took me in some ways until the very end of my dissertation. I discovered that Beecher in particular was using a particular style of public speaking that nobody seems to have used before him. He was speaking with these sort of rising and falling qualities in his voice, and some other aspects of his speaking that seemed unique to people at the time. And I read the descriptions of him speaking, and I thought, I've heard that before. And I realized where I had heard that was in the recording we have of William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech.
That's right. Wow. Yeah.
And so I pulled that up, and there it is. He's using whatever this style is. He's using the same style that Beecher is using. So I decided that I wanted to write about charisma, and so I start trying to disentangle what exactly I was talking about. It took not only the entire dissertation, but I don't think I fully got there until I was really done with the final revision of the book manuscript.
Yeah.
And what I realized is I'm talking about three overlapping phenomena. First, the speaking style that these guys are using. Second, the sort of emotional relationship between these figures. And that's something that I picked up on in, and you asked, how do you study this? Well, the answer is I study it by looking at the letters of people who were inspired by these speakers.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So,
you know what? It's funny that
you're
you're looking at exactly what Michael McGurr asked you to do, which was kind of like interrogate within yourself. What is it that made you respond to Woodrow Wilson? It seems like in your historical work, you're following up and like going back and looking into the historical record and trying to figure out, the people that responded to these people in this way, what was going through their minds? Why did they find these people so, I guess, magnetic is the word?
Absolutely. And one of the things, you asked about history of emotions, and there's a number of ways that you can approach the history of emotions. One of the most common ways that Peter Stearns has invented, and I think it's a really interesting approach, is to look at what he calls emotionology, or the study of emotional standards. Mm. So basically, you look at his best book is called American Cool, and so his argument is that before the 1920s, Americans, and particularly American men, were supposed to be very emotive and to show off their emotions and to cry in public and things like this. And then starting in the 1920s, there's this shift to this sense that you should hide your emotions and that you should be cool and suave and not really show people what you're feeling. And so that's one way to study it. Like, what are the expectations for people's emotions?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then psychohistory. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just affirming that makes sense to me. I was thinking about that kind of stoicism that's expected of men was something that came up in my own research about GIs during the Vietnam War. Before they had a kind of terms to describe things like shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder is the term that eventually becomes the kind of medical term for the phenomenon. But they were often in the literature describing men that were unable to describe unable to express emotions, even about the profoundly disturbing experiences they'd had in war, and they called it John Wayne syndrome. Wayne and the syndrome was, he can't talk about his emotions. He's too tied up in the image of masculinity that is the dominant image in the culture. And that to me, that's all that popped into my head when you were talking just now, is that how you can study the emotions that way by kind of looking at expectation and looking at the kind of larger cultural expectation. I didn't realize that that there was this kind of like moment in American history where being emotive was much more the standard masculine model. Right, absolutely. You should read American Cool. It's a brilliant book.
Yeah. But so that's one way of doing it. And then psychohistory, of course, is another, which has been sort of discredited.
Right.
And I think rightly so for the most part. But my approach is very simple. My approach is neither of those. My approach is read their letters and see what they say, and then write about it.
Yeah.
Yes, people lie. I mean, the project I'm working on now, at least tentatively, is a project about con men and alternate realities, and that's a different story. Those people lie all the time. It's what they do. But your ordinary person writing a letter to William Jennings Bryan, they're just telling you about how they feel, and they're telling you. And all you have to do is listen. We have a tendency as historians to overanalyze this stuff, to look at these letters and say, well, let's try to figure out what they really meant and what motivated them. No, just read it and write about what they say.
Yeah.
And so that really got me to this relationship that these charismatic figures are building with these followers. And then finally, there's this sort of discussion of democracy, like what is the role of emotion? What is the role of ordinary people in democracy? Because I realized that for leaders who turn to charisma, who embraced charisma, they're putting a lot of power in the hands of their followers. People like to look at charisma as manipulative, as sort of demagoguery, but it's not necessarily. It can be. It's a tool. It can be used by someone like Hitler to be a demagogue. But for someone who's a more honest politician who's using this approach, what you're doing is saying, I'm going to try to convince the people that I'm right, and if they buy it, if they get this sort of emotional response to me, then I win, and otherwise I lose.
Yeah, yeah.
And so
is this something that political parties? I mean, you know a political operative. It seems like political parties have to be aware of this. And I'm talking about like today in 2018, have to be aware that the candidates they choose have to do some level of emotional signaling.
Well, I've talked to some political operatives about this, and the sense that I get is they're sort of dimly aware of this, but they have no idea how to approach it. And what they're looking for, particularly on the left, is some kind of a model, some kind of a universal set of tools that they can teach a candidate to be more charismatic.
Right.
And really, there are no universals here. It's all situational. You have to look at what the candidate is good at on their own, and then try to build that into a type of charisma. I mean, nobody, look at Bernie Sanders, for instance, who inspired this incredible charismatic following, but is really not a charismatic guy at all. I mean, his charisma is entirely situational.
I think his charisma might lie in the fact that he's kind of like he sounds like an old Jewish New Yorker, which has its own kind of like emotional signaling to people, and young people responded to him as this kind of funny old crank. I feel like there was something going on with the charisma with Bernie Sanders, but it was more the ideas. But I don't know, I feel like there were a lot of young people, like when that bird landed on his podium. And people they were hoping for some kind of magical, magnetic moment like that. It's just the candidates themselves. The parties are just hoping that they find people like this. But I think about did you write this book during the Obama years?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, isn't Obama a master emotional signaler?
Well, I think actually, I yes and no. I mean, in some ways. I wrote this book because of my profound disappointment with Obama.
Yeah, right.
Because Obama demonstrated. I mean, I did vote for Obama in the primary in 2008, but I wasn't happy about it. I really, between Howard Dean and Bernie Sanders, there really wasn't anybody that I was excited about.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason was that I had read Obama's book. I mean, I loved Obama when he gave that speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention.
Yep.
But then I read his book. I read The Audacity of Hope, and he goes on and on about this sort of golden age of compromise in the 50s and 60s and how he wants to return to that. And I just knew, this is a guy who fetishizes compromise.
Yeah,
That's how he's going to govern, and that's not what I want. I want a bomb thrower.
But if you're looking at the way you did your book, and you're looking at if you're reading the letters that people write to Obama, and how they respond to him, it seems like Obama's fans have a deep emotional investment in him, and really
they
connect to him.
Don't. I mean, he gave these incredible speeches in 2008, but then when he was elected president, there are these stories that he believes that it's wrong to give emotional speeches and to try to sell policy in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so he intentionally abandons that style. I mean, this is a guy with incredible political skills who chooses not to use them because of some misguided idea of what good government is.
It's almost so you can, in the way you're seeing it, it's almost like there are a lot of people who project a lot onto Obama, and it feels like he was a Rorschach president in that sense of people saw what they wanted to see.
I think Obama was intensely charismatic in his campaign, and then he just didn't follow through at all as president.
Yeah,
I wasn't expecting him to be a sort of mushy centrist who fetishized compromise. I wasn't expecting him to abandon charisma. That surprised me.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is, I mean, I'm definitely, graduate school really pulls me very far to the left.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, actually, it was Tom Segru's Origins of the Urban Crisis that did it.
I
read it in my first semester of grad school.
Yep.
And it had a particular impact on me because my mom grew up in Detroit during the exact events that he lays out in that book. And so I had always heard this one version of how white flight happened and how the 67 riots happened. And I'm reading this book and I'm realizing, this I totally side with the African Americans here. Like, they are completely right. The whites in the city are horrible. They are racist, and they are creating this permanent underclass, and the riot is totally justified. And I remember I was in an airport, I think traveling to a conference, and I called my mom and I said, I have to talk to you about this. And I told her about the book, and she didn't deny anything that was in the book, but she still said that the riot was not justified.
Yeah.
And that just shook me to my core. I'm like, this is the belief that I grew up with, and this doesn't make any sense. And so I started re-examining everything that I believe politically. I started re-examining my views on feminism. I never really considered myself a feminist before then, and then I became much stronger in that direction, and really my views on all sorts of things. But I never really became, I mean, I'm not a socialist. I don't identify as a socialist. I'm comfortable with Bernie Sanders, largely because I don't think he's a real socialist. I think he's kind of a New Deal Democrat with some
I think that's
socialist
true.
rhetoric.
Yeah. But I mean, in America and in the Democratic Party, you know, that he's the closest you would get to socialism, I feel like at this
Right.
point. Yeah.
But I'm a sort of weird political animal these days, because I probably temperamentally and politically I still lean more toward liberalism, but I am just incredibly frustrated with the rhetoric coming out of liberalism and the complacency coming out of liberalism. I mean, the way that you win is you get angry and you throw bombs and you show people that you are willing to fight for that. And when I hear liberals say like, I think probably the worst thing I've ever heard a politician say in my lifetime was when Hillary Clinton said, "America is already great."
Right. That was a bad emotional signaling for sure.
That was the worst emotional signaling I've ever heard in my life. Like no, you don't say America is already great. You say, let's make America great, but it's never been great. Let's make it better than it's ever been before. Let's you know, take it, or as Howard Dean put it, I want my country back.
Yep.
You know, that's a completely different kind of emotional signaling. And so I find myself in many ways frustrated with both sides in the sort of left liberal political divide.
Definitely.
I like the competence and the basic ability of the people on the liberal side, and I like the rhetoric and the bomb throwing of the people and the energy of the people on the left. And so my mission is sort of what I wanted to convey with this book is, you know, people on the right understand that politics is all emotional messaging.
It seems
and people
like
on the left are obsessed with ideology. They're obsessed with ideas and policies, and that's not what voters care about. Voters want this sort of emotional, this passion in the sense that you're fighting for them, and that's what they're really excited about.
So would you say that Hillary Clinton's failure was a failure of charisma? Is charisma a big explainer for you for what happened in the 2016 election?
Not exactly, because in some ways, I think the 2016 election challenges my thesis because it really, in many ways, it's the most ideologically centered election in modern history. I mean, it's so much about globalization and the decline of you know, the Rust Belt and those things that people are really affected by, and that are being played to in some ways by Trump and Sanders in different ways,
right?
And that are just not being addressed by Clinton. But and I think Clinton she has this interview with Humans of New York, the Facebook page, in which she says, you know, I used to get angry, and then people attacked me for being a hysterical woman, and so now I've learned that I can't get angry anymore. And you know, that's completely fair. That's completely justifiable. She has been the brunt of more unfair attacks than probably anybody in recent political history.
Oh yeah, and the people who don't remember the 90s don't remember how vicious the misogynist attacks on Hillary Clinton really were. Yeah,
I think that there is a window opening up now for it's always, and this is the theme of my research as well. It's always been much more difficult for women to use charisma in American history without being attacked for it, and it's still true. I think we're starting to see an opening for more angry female political figures, more charismatic female political figures like Elizabeth Warren. But this is very, very new. And Clinton isn't wrong, but to some degree she just can't do that and couldn't do that. And so I don't blame her exactly. I don't blame her for that. I do blame her for the messaging, for the rhetoric, for America is already good.
Yeah,
but I
and
don't blame
poor
her
messaging.
for
But
not
I mean,
standing up there and waving her arms around.
when I just had last week I had a guest on this show. The episode's actually about to be posted right now. That's we talked a lot about pro wrestling and kind of like the template of pro wrestling as a kind of lens into the way that emotions work in American discourse and things like that. But either way, one of the things we talked about was that build the wall chant that Trump got thousands of people to do in these different campaign events. It seems like that's almost a prototypical example of what you're talking about, which is that the build the wall chant was really more about the chant than it was actually building a wall or immigration policy. I mean, obviously those things are part of it, but it feels like there was something else going on there.
Oh, that's absolutely true. Yeah, and one thing that I was thinking again about what you asked about how do you study emotions and how the way I study emotions is different from how other people study it, and I think the key difference is that previous generations of scholars have been very invested in what is the cause of people's emotions, what makes people react emotionally the way that they do.
Right.
And I'm more interested in emotions and emotional expression as a cause. People react this way. Let's start with that. What does this do? What work does this do in society? How do these emotional expressions shape society? Because that's something that, again, I learned from early childhood. What causes the emotions is not important. What matters is how the emotions affect the situation that we're in.
Yeah, right.
And so that's what I want to know. It's not what makes people charismatic, what makes people chant "lock her up." It's what is the political work that chanting "lock her up" does. How does this affect society? How does this shape elections and shape in some ways very traditional categories of history, politics, economics, military service. Emotions shape those things, and I think it allows us to take a really fresh look at some decidedly not fresh aspects of American history. To look at them, to look at emotions as sort of primary actors in creating historical change.
I think your work is absolutely vital. It's really, really great stuff. I saw on your Twitter that you got some attention when there was a little flare up a few weeks ago about speculating that Oprah was going to be a presidential candidate. I didn't get to see any of the things that you were saying, but how were you responding to that idea? Because it feels like it's a kind of a classic example of what you're talking about. Oprah came and gave a speech at was it the Grammys? The Golden Globes. It was the Golden Globes.
So. Yeah,
she gave a speech that was kind of about addressing the hashtag Me Too thing, and I'm not sure anyone remembers the content of her speech as much as they remember how great it made them feel.
Well, I'm going to admit something to you, which I haven't admitted to anybody else publicly, which is that when I made those tweets and when I gave those interviews, I had not actually watched the speech yet.
It's Oprah, so it's like it's not anything different than what she is already. Yeah.
Right. Well, in 2015, when Trump started actually polling at the head of the field, and it started to look like this was going to be a real thing, I started to just wonder, who else could do this? What other sort of celebrity could just jump into a presidential race and be an instant front runner? Like who else has this kind of ability? And the only name that came to mind was Oprah. Yeah. And part of it was because I had read Catherine Lawson's brilliant book on Oprah, which came out in 2011, and I corresponded with her about it. She basically argues that Oprah's movement is best understood as a religious movement rather than as a sort of traditional political following, because it's structured. The Oprah book clubs are like churches, and the way that she sells it, and what she's selling is something that is decidedly neoliberal. I mean, she's selling basically uplift and self-help but it's just the way that Oprah resonates with people. And I remember watching her on the campaign trail. Campaigning for Obama in 2008, the only time she's ever really gotten involved in politics directly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Obama is a charismatic guy, and she made him look like a stick of driftwood up there.
Oh yeah,
she just talked circles around him. Yep. And I'm like, this person has more charisma in her little finger than any like the entire U.S. Senate combined.
Yeah, she's almost a magical being. Yep.
Exactly right, and so for the last 2 years, I've been talking my wife's ear off about this. Oprah should run for president, and then the more I thought about it, I thought this is a terrible idea because Oprah is a neoliberal, and like she's Hillary Clinton with lots of charisma.
Yeah. She's the same political vision, just a package that could actually get elected.
Maybe you want that in a given election if you're like down by 10 points, and like Trump's going to win re-election and she's the only hope. Sure, I'll go for that. But not right now. Not when it looks like Trump is doing badly and anybody could beat him.
Yeah,
or anybody would have a chance of beating him. No, I don't want that. And that's kind of the argument that I made. The argument I made was, first of all, don't discount Oprah's ability to jump in and immediately be a front runner. And Oprah, unlike so many celebrities, really has a very worked out political vision. It's not one I really like, but it's something that she's thought about these issues a lot, as Trump has. I mean, she's not like you listen to The Rock talking about how he wants to run for president. He clearly has no idea what he would do as president.
Yeah, The Rock and I would say The Rock and Kid Rock both have really awful grasps of politics. They have I guess some of the emotional signaling because they're already celebrities, and I think that's part of what I don't know. Part of what your work kind of points me to is that the people that have charisma are in our culture and in American society today are by and large from the celebrity class, not from the political class. I
think that's true, and I've been thinking about this because you want to think you have a celebrity president, who can go up against a celebrity president? Well, for one thing, and I think I read an article, can't remember who it was by, right after the election, who commenting on Berlusconi and how the left was finally able to defeat Berlusconi by running these very sort of bland functionaries who only talk about issues and didn't bring up Berlusconi's antics. Right. So I don't think you have to have a celebrity to be the celebrity. But I mean, one of the interesting things about how the field is shaping up in 2020, and of course nobody's officially in except for John Delaney, who has no chance. But like I said, the only two candidates that I've actually liked since I really became a Democrat are Howard Dean and Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there are a lot of candidates that are potentially running that I can get behind. Yeah. There's a lot of people that excite me.
Okay. Well, either way, it sounds like that's going to have to happen if the Democrats have a chance to stop the rush of Trumpism, is to recognize at least that liberals are wringing their hands now, wanting politics to be rational. They think the facts are on their side, and since the facts are on our side, we should therefore be winning. But it seems like your work and the work of others in thinking about affect and thinking about emotion and charisma and personal magnetism and all that kind of stuff, all that stuff comes to bear, I would argue, more powerfully than logic and facts and rationality, right? And so, in that sense, it feels like the Democrats have to get on Trump's level in some respects and figure out how to signal emotionally to the American people in a way that's more compelling than Trump.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that, honestly, it's very difficult for academics. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, I have some personal experience in this regard. But for most academics, I think it's very, very difficult to consider the idea that being really interested in issues and in logic and in rational thought is not inherently better than being motivated primarily by emotional signaling. Yeah, it's not inherently better. It is, academics are supposed to give a voice to the voiceless. And who is more voiceless in academia than people who don't care about ideology, people who don't care about issues, who sort of form their ideology on the basis of a response, of an emotional response to somebody that is sort of ideologically based, but in a very subtle way. And I think that we need to, and particularly, not only academics, but also the Democratic Party and the sort of left establishment needs to really recognize that we're in the minority if we think politics should be this sort of rational force for issue and policy positions.
When it's closer to religion or closer to even I would say entertainment, in the sense of what people are getting from it and why people watch it and why people consume politics is in part for that emotional charge that you get from religion. And so the looking for rationalism within that can be very frustrating.
Absolutely. And I mean, you said entertainment. Sports is a good example of this. You're right about pro wrestling. I'm a big baseball fan, and I never watch the games. Mm-hmm. and I don't need to watch the games because I don't care about the actual baseball. I care about baseball as metaphor. I'm interested in the stories and what it means for for a player from a small town who's had a lot of adversity to triumph over a stud pitcher, and that's what people are interested in politics too. They're interested in this sort of vision of the good life that's conveyed through metaphor.
Yep.
Politics, if you ignore metaphor, then what you're still sending out emotional signals. You're just sending out bad ones. Out ones
right. Yeah. Jeremy Young, these are such great ideas. Thanks so much for joining me and sharing them with me and telling me your story. Really, really, I think compelling stuff and things that we'll be unpacking on the Nostalgia Trap for a while. Thanks for explaining all that to me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
All right, I had a great time talking to Jeremy C. Young. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. You can find more of his work on Twitter. He's at Jeremy C. Young. Got a great Twitter feed there that engages with a lot of these ideas. So check that out, and please, if you can, donate to the show as much as you can. It really, really would help keep the show going, something that I really feel strongly about, and I know a lot of people out there do too. So if you're one of those people and you're not donating to the show, please consider giving $5-10 a month to keep the show going. It would really, really help me out and help the show continue to grow, which is what we want to do here on the Nostalgia Trap. All right, take care. Have a good one. You can find that donation button at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.